Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in person or virtually whenever you are watching this. My name is Anne Bennett. I am the Executive Director of the Laurel Historical Society here in Laurel, Maryland. I am joined by our panelists, Tina Simmons, as well as Abby and Genevieve from the Laurel Museum. And tonight we're going to be talking about Forest Haven. The institute that we know currently as Forest Haven has a rather dark and long and tragic history, a kind of hidden history here in Laurel. So we're going to explore that tonight and go through in support of our exhibit. It's all Laurel, City Limits and Beyond. And I want to make sure. Okay, thank you. All right, so Abby and Genevieve, they're going to be helping us here with the chat. I just want to make sure that I can get my notes up here, and then I'll be back in just a second. So, okay, Tina, what slide are you seeing right now?
Geography.
Okay, perfect. Excellent. So what I'm going to do is again, just wanted to talk a little bit about the context and background, and then Tina's going to jump in, and then her contribution is really with all the incredible research that she has done with our genealogy. So she's going to get to that toward the end of the lecture, but I wanted to kind of set the context for it and really dive into this talk in three different sections: the geography, the history, and then the genealogy. And we wanted to do a presentation on Forest Haven because it's a research subject that we get fairly often requested at the archives, and it represents a fairly I think little known history of Laurel. We might have heard about it, but because Laurel has, new populations and new residents moving in, not everyone knows about the history or actually even knows where it's located. So that's why we wanted to jump in with that. And I did want to say just a couple words of introduction before we get started, is that even though it is October when we're recording this and it's spooky season, you'll hear tragic stories of actual people who lived and died there. So we want to honor their stories and their memories by educating our membership about what happened there. So it really was a house of horrors in all imaginable ways, but it's not in a fun Halloween way. So I just wanted to be sure that, we keep that in mind and be respectful of the history that happened there. And also to remember that there are relatives of people that both lived in there as patients and work there as faculty or staff who are still in this area, or as you'll hear from Tina in a little bit, still connected and documenting their family history. One other thing is that as we go through the slides, we have clippings of historic newspaper articles. I want to stress that you will see historic newspapers using terminology and phrases that we don't use anymore, and we don't advocate and we don't condone anymore. But we need to, as historians and researchers, understand that that was what was used and appropriate for the time period in which these articles were written. So you might see, and you will see, titles and phrases that are offensive in our modern period. And I just wanted to let you know as we go through that these are historic articles. And then finally, what I wanted to say, just kind of as a preface, is that this webinar is not an endorsement to actually visit the property. It is illegal to do so. Tina actually has visited the property, but she did so as a researcher. She did through proper legal channels, and she'll tell you about her experience with that. But it is owned by the federal government. It is not something you can just walk into and explore because you think it's a cool place. So I just wanted to get a couple of those disclaimers out of the way. We don't usually kind of have these topics that we're talking about, but again, we thought it was really important to talk about that as well. Okay, and Tina, I'm looking at a couple of different screens. So are you seeing the Google
map
now? Okay,
Yes.
perfect. Thank you for keeping me on track. So what I want to do again is set the geographical context for it. So much of our current exhibit is based in geography. I used to teach cultural geography at community college, so I'm a real big map nerd as well. But what we're looking at here is, this is just a Google view of Anne Arundel County, side of Laurel. So it's, you can see if you did want to drive to the area, but again, not stay because it's illegal to trespass. You'll see that it's about a 15-minute drive from Laurel Historical Society all the way on the far end of Main Street to, go down 198 past the Target. It's actually just down the road from the new development of Watershed, if you're familiar with that new complex, and just before you get to Casey's Crab Company. So that can kind of give you the little orientation. One interesting thing to know and make a distinction about is that even though the property is in Laurel and in Anne Arundel County, it is actually owned by the District of Columbia. So it's, federal and government property. So it's kind of surrounded, by the other jurisdictions and municipalities. So what you can see here in the kind of Google aerial view, we can set the tone a little better. So again, you can see the Walmart Supercenter, Sam's Club, Russett's, all kind of to the far left of your screen. You can see the triangle that's formed by 295, the BW Parkway, and then 198, like I said, heading toward Fort Meade. And then that complex kind of in that middle of the triangle is the area we're going to be talking about. And so you can see that there are still named properties there. So it's still active, it's still in use, it's just not in use like it was when it was the property that's known as Forest Haven. So Tina, did you want to kind of orient the viewers to where we're talking about in terms of the cemetery?
The cemetery is right underneath the area. It says, I'm trying to
Sorry.
Maya Angelou Academy, A1 New Beginnings. The cemetery is right under that. No, I'm sorry, it's right above that area. It's marked in green on your map. It says Training School Cemetery. That's one of the names that it's been known to go by.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Tina. So we'll see that in a little bit, kind of the naming distinctions of that. So
Right.
the district training school versus Forest Haven. And then, like we said, it still is an active property. So there are people working and using the property at the New Beginnings, the Youth Rehabilitation Department, Woodlands Job Center, that kind of thing. And then finally, again, we don't have a lot of pictures, so we took a lot from online searches. And so this is another kind of bird's eye view of the abandoned buildings that were part of the Forest Haven complex. So you can see kind of up to the very, very upper left hand, you can see some of the newer buildings, the cars, the parking lot, abuts right what used to be the Forest Haven complex. And it is surprising because it was what, 200, 300 acres, Tina, I believe, and they had,
I don't know the whole size.
yeah, but it's fairly large. I mean, even now when you're looking at it, there were quite a few acres of property and, 20, 30 different buildings there. So that's kind of what we're looking at as well on this aerial view. And then I think that's what I wanted to say about that. And
That's a
then,
better view
yeah, this
of
is
the
one of
cemetery
yours.
location. The part closest to the arrow is an open field. We've never found any graves there, but above the sort of dotted lines, but within that shape, that's where all the graves have been found that we know of.
So yeah, I don't know if you can see it, but kind of there's the arrow and kind of the empty open space, and then a lot of what we just saw on the aerial view, you can see the darker color buildings down below. Okay, so that kind of sets the geographical context for it. So let's go into the history a little bit. So again, I apologize because none of these pictures are ours, like I said. So we are relying from people who have obtained them somehow. Some of these could be legally obtained and on the site with permission, like Tina did, but other ones, it's very popular for urban explorers who go there illegally. So I do apologize over the quality of some of these photos. They're just kind of blown up and taken from online. You'll see that in the cemetery, and we saw even on Google Map, it was just called like the district training school or the district cemetery. And so we're going to touch on the history of the property before Tina gets into her work. And so the institution first opened in 1925, and it does have, the older terminology. So district training school for the mentally retarded, which was the terminology at the time. It was owned by the district then, as it is now, like I mentioned earlier, and it was intended for both children and adults with intellectual disabilities, some physical ailments as well. And over the course of the almost 7 decades that it was open, it shifted in terms of who they would take in as patients. And it used to be with, more severe physical or mental disabilities, but then it got to be any type of patient that people couldn't, take care of responsibly in their own homes. And so you get people with epilepsy, for example, which, we wouldn't institutionalize today, or even some tuberculosis patients, or things that are just kind of societally undesirable, or people didn't know how to accommodate them and give them proper care. A lot of them over the decades ended up here in Forest Haven. In the beginning, it was it was intended to be again like a well-being center. It was supposed to be for the benefit to take care of these patients, and it was actually kind of a farm-like setting. So you can see even on the aerial view, there's not a lot around it, except for Walmart over there, but you can imagine, about 100 years ago, it was, very open farmlands, and the treatment and behavior toward individuals with disabilities was different than it is today. And in many cases, the action was just to remove them from their families and just have, an institution or a place where they could go to deal with it. It had, I think, again, over 200 acres, so it was a fairly large complex, and about 20 or 25 buildings. So it was very large, as we saw. And jumping ahead a little bit, and I'll come back around to it in our timeline, it did change its name to Forest Haven in 1963, which is the name that we kind of refer to it as today, and that most people are familiar with. It was closed permanently in 1991, but it was not properly decommissioned. So some of these photographs that you'll see in a little bit that we grabbed from online, you'll see why I say that it was not properly decommissioned. It was not properly handled. It really just was abandoned. People walked away, and that was the end of it. So according to the records, the secondary sources, I also looked at, the first burial was recorded in 1928. So that's about 2 or 3 years after it first opened. And Tina will mention this more in her portion of the talk, but there's this monument essentially, and it has the names of the adults and children who lived and died while they were at Forest Haven. And I forget, Tina, do you know how many names are actually on there, or a ballpark?
There are 391 names on the monument.
Right. And over the course, again, of these decades, there were thousands of people in there. And I think at the largest, it was over 1,000 people at one time in this complex that were there as patients.
Let me jump in for a second. When we first went there, we transcribed the names from the monument. We weren't photographing monuments in those days. but we hand transcribed the names. And after we started doing some research, we realized that in addition to just the names on the monument, there are row numbers. Those row numbers indicated where the people were buried, and actually from the top left to the bottom right, they're in order of the time that they died. So
Okay, so yeah, from the very beginning, like the 1920s up
right.
until
Mhm.
all the way to the end, like into the 80s and 90s, is that?
Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. So what we're gonna kind of do now is, I know again, some of this is a little blurry, but what I wanted to kind of go through just a brief timeline kind of through the decades until we get to talking more about Tina's research. And so at first, when the institution first opened in the 20s and into the 30s, it was growing and it was budgeted normally, as you can see from these newspaper clippings. So they show requests for proposals, so RFPs from the 1920s for several of the buildings, including it mentions the dormitories, there was a power plant for different types of utility work and contractors seeking proposals. And also on the property, in addition to dormitories and offices, there was a cafeteria, there's a gym, there's a theater, there's a baseball field. I didn't include it in the presentation tonight, but we have newspaper clippings of the scores for their baseball teams. There was a chapel as well. So it really was kind of a self-centered institution at first. So as we move into the 1930s, we can still see it. And again, we have to take with a grain of salt the terminology here. But as we move into the 1930s, we can still see that it has a good reputation in general. Toward the end of the article, it says that district training school in Anne Arundel County, a few miles from Laurel, it's grown to 530. Again, they call them inmates. They did make an effort in the 60s to change that terminology to patients. And the plans have been expanding to double its present size. So the buildings in the complex as well. But even at that time, there's kind of an ominous foreshadowing about the inadequate care, the overcrowding, and the lack of trained staff that will come, because they said even doubling its size, it's not enough to meet the demands of that time. And that was only a decade or so after it opened. And so so during this time period and throughout most of its history, we can see that there were also staff and faculty at the institution. It wasn't just inmates and physicians. And so their families could also live on the site as well. And that's something that Tina was able to point out to me. So things like wedding or death announcements, including someone who lived at Forest Haven, are not uncommon to see in the local papers. So you see wedding or engagement announcements. They indicate that they're teaching at the training school in Laurel, or that they had lived there and then they're going to be buried elsewhere, Arlington and National Cemetery in this case. And so I think that just kind of gives a different understanding of kind of what was happening. It wasn't just kind of in the beginning just kind of a sterile institution with just patients and doctors. It really was striving to be a more vibrant, self-caring institution. But when we head into the post-war period, so we have some articles from the 50s and 60s coming up, we start to see much more commonly the disturbing headlines that will permeate the history of Forest Haven really from here on out. And so the headline on the left is just one example of the declining care that the patients were receiving. And again, tragically, what will become the norm for the remaining decades that the institution is open. So we see that abuse, neglect, improper care, and feeding of the patients were common complaints during this time period, and escalating into the 1970s when there was a lawsuit against the Justice Department, and it resulted in dozens, if not hundreds, of deaths over the years. The headline on the left, just the top part of that newspaper article, is another disturbing aspect of the institution, that of patient on patient or patient staff relationships. And in this particular story, there were two teenage boys, I think 16 and 17, who stole a rifle from an employee's locker, staff member at the institution, and then ran away from the institution. And then one of the boys killed the other boy, and basically hid his body in the woods on Fort Meade property, and then started to essentially brag about it to the staff. And then that led to the investigation, and they were able to recover the other boy's body at that point. So you can kind of see, the mental health aspects, the relationships with patients, each other, and then just the improper care that they're getting if they can escape and steal weapons, and murder each other. So like I said, circling back to our brief timeline from the beginning, the name changed to Forest Haven in 1963, but it was more than just a name change. At this time, a federal, I think a law, or House of Representatives or delegates, I forget which, but it made it possible essentially for the district, again, the District of Columbia, to conduct its own intake procedures for patients. Because before there had to be a lengthy process of a court hearing or order to make sure that basically patients were there voluntarily, that their family had some input, that they knew documentation of their ailments, their disabilities. And with that switch over, they didn't have to have that background anymore. So this is when you could take in anybody for any type of ailment. And like we said, people with tuberculosis or epilepsy or different types of disabilities were being admitted, and they weren't necessarily what we would think of as being appropriate level of care for that type of conditions. And so, as you would expect, because there's not really those regulations for intake anymore, that had a huge impact on the increase of population. So there was a larger incoming patients. But at that same time, in the 60s, there was also a reduction of funding. So things like, the physical well-being department, recreation facilities, equipment, they were all cut. And it did lead increasingly to these terrible conditions. So the articles you're seeing here from the 70s, we see a weird kind of mix of promotion of the site, like celebration, and also revelation of the tragedies that were occurring at the time. So the article on the left is celebrating the construction of a new 200-bed facility named after Helen Gurley, a nurse who had been there for 31 years. That opened in 1871. But then several years later, the article from 1976 indicates that one of the superintendents was leaving the institution about being very openly critical about what was happening at Forest Haven, especially for the lack of political assistance. He felt like politicians were just turning an eye, not really understanding what was happening at Forest Haven. And also he felt very strongly that working with family, working with the community to rehabilitate or to rehouse these patients in a proper, loving environment would be the best thing for him. And then he essentially just basically resigned after having that confrontation and speaking out about it. Also in this time period from 1973 to about 1978, we have several lawsuits against the DC government seeking better conditions, better treatment for the patients, better physical conditions at the buildings. Most notably, there was a case Evans versus Fenty, and in some cases, these were raised by the family members of patients who had died. Tragically, there was a woman, I believe, who had entered the institution when she was 6 and passed away when she was 18. There was another young person there as well. After the lawsuit, many of the patients actually were relocated to group homes, but Forest Haven still remained open up at the time in the late 70s. And it was documented that physicians with suspended licenses were still allowed to practice at Forest Haven or to be on staff there. And in the 1980s, there were charges of staff members for theft and misappropriation of funds and equipment by a staff member. And it wasn't toward the very end of the 1980s that the Justice Department began taking a much stronger look at the deaths that were occurring much more frequently and tragically at this point. And so what they were finding was that there were just dozens of cases of abuse of the patients, both by just absolute neglect, not taking care of them. There were also deaths by improper feeding, of force feeding, of feeding with a feeding tube, feeding when patients were lying down, which causes like basically asphyxiation. They basically choking to death on the food that they can't digest. There was physical abuse, there was sexual abuse, again, patient and staff. So it really just was very tragic and in many ways. And dozens of people in this time period died as a result of the abuse and the neglect that they received here. And so what happened is that, I'm seeing this slide here. Let me just, focus on that for just a little bit. So that was all happening in the 80s, that the Justice Department began monitoring it much more closely. And then it did officially close in October of 1991. And at that time, all of the last remaining patients were moved out to either group homes or to other district facilities, actually within the District of Columbia boundaries. And it was just abandoned. As you can see, again, these are pictures from people who have trespassed on the property, most likely, but they just walked away. So you can see there's furniture, there's toys, there's equipment just as it was, there's paperwork, there's telephones, everything. It was just abandoned, and it wasn't decommissioned properly. None of this was taken away, none of it was disposed of. So there's asbestos hanging everywhere, there's other hazards on the property, and you can see from these pictures inside that again, and outside, that it's just full of a lot of hazards. And so I think, unfortunately, on kind of that note, I'm gonna pass it over to Tina, because again, we know that this is a hard history for people to hear, and there are, just as Tina said, close to 400 names on that stone that we know of. And there's people like Tina documenting and trying to tell these stories back a little bit about the people who lived there and some of the people who died there as well. So thank you for listening to this hard history. Continue to put your stories and your memories in the chat. We would love to continue to tell this story and to document it for future generations. So Tina, that's what I have to say about that. I'm going to advance the slide, and if you want to get started with your portion, we'd love to hear about your additional research. And I guess, again, first, tell us a little bit more about who you are and how you came to this project.
Okay. I'm a member of the Anne Arundel Genealogical Society. That's a volunteer organization. It has no government ties. And I have been researching cemeteries for that organization for over 30 years. I do research on all the known cemeteries in Anne Arundel County, and as well as locating the cemetery, I try to find information on all the burials within that cemetery, and if I can find extra source information, death certificates, obituaries, funeral programs, that type thing, I add them to the records. I have also branched out. I'm also a board member of the Coalition to Protect Maryland Burial Sites. And with that hat, I'm helping to research cemeteries all over Maryland. So that's kind of the background for me. This is a little bit about how I got interested in Forest Haven. I was contacted by a man in Pittsburgh who was trying to locate a cousin that was buried there. She had attended Oak Hill, and the cemetery caretaker told me her name was on the monument. The man that contacted me indicated that his name was that her name was misspelled and wanted to get it changed. That's never happened. But we did manage to find information about her. Next slide, please. The second story. I found a woman who was looking for details about her great aunt. She was never given details as to what happened with the child. Child had cerebral palsy and was removed from the family. I was able to give her information from the monument and a photograph of a marker for her grave. I found her death certificate. Now, this cemetery was a District of Columbia, technically Children's Developmental Center and mental institution. It was known as Forest Haven, the District of Columbia Training School, the District Training School, Fuller State Hospital, Fuller State School, and Patuxent Mental Hospital. So you see a variety of names across the board. Dennis Green and I originally visited the cemetery to transcribe information from that monument and to verify the names and death dates. What we discovered was that there were burials behind the monument in a large open field. The monument itself reads, "This monument honors the memory of the men, women, and children who lived at Forest Haven and came to be laid at rest in this cemetery between 1928 and 1982. When I was transcribing the information off the monument, Dennis was slightly probing the field behind the cemetery. What he found was a plaque in the ground, slightly under the grass, probably about 3 or 4 inches deep, that had the person's name, their birth date, their death date, their race, and their sex. All I knew before was their name. So this gave us a lot of information to go by. We'll go to the next slide. This was a person with Down syndrome. Father deserted the family. His mother died. He was listed on the census at the district training school. I found his name on the monument, but was never able to find a marker for him. I did find his death certificate and sent it to the person who was looking for it. Next slide. Okay, next. This is what the monument looks like. And when you look at it carefully, the names are in order from the earliest on the left all the way to the bottom of the right, according to when they died. You can see a little piece of the field behind. That's where all these burials are. Next slide, please. This is an aerial view. The left side is an open field. We found no markers there. The right side is where you can see markers. Next slide. This is what is in that field. when you look at aerial views, you can see these are definitely in rows. They're all about the same size. Depressions, they look different than the grass on the surface. This is how we were able to tell where these were, where to start looking for these little plaques. Next slide. This is what we actually found. There on the left, this is a concrete cylinder that it was at the head of the grave, and on the top of it was attached the marker on the right. It has the person's name, which I've wiped out in this case. They were a white male, their birth date, and their death date. This person was about 6 months old when they died. Next slide. This is an example of one of the death certificates. I've wiped out the name on this, but in the bottom, the second row up from the bottom, it says DTS Cemetery, Laurel, rural Anne Arundel County, Maryland. That's what a number of these look like. This person actually had epilepsy, and they were placed in the institution because of that. Next slide. This gives you an idea of the log I created, telling what row number and how many graves on that row the person is buried, their name. On this sheet, I only found one marker. A lot of times these were cut up. They had been hit by lawn mowers. They had been dislodged from the cylinder. Some were close to the Little Patuxent River, which is known to flood. And I think they probably are no longer there. I have the age of the person, their length as a resident. I got that from the death certificates, whether or not I found a death certificate, and a little bit about them. All these people were technically residents at one time of the District of Columbia. However, they came to Forest Haven from a bunch of different places. Some lived in different counties in Maryland. I think probably the furthest away that I found was in Bluemont, Virginia. Okay. Once we realized that there was more than just the names on the monument, we requested access to the cemetery to probe for more markers. Dennis Green and I made 9 trips to the cemetery between May of 2010 and October of 2011. We also found a single handmade flat tombstone as well, and all the markers that we found were round, with the exception of one that was a square brass plaque under a tree with one of the residents' names. The one that was the handmade headstone, by 2010, when we were there, it was missing. A lot of the markers were found about 4 inches underneath the ground surface. Some were in entirely different areas than the burial was supposed to be. In all, there are 391 names on the monument. We have found 118 of the brass markers. I have death certificates for a number of those individuals. And I also have death certificates for 16 individuals listed as buried in that cemetery who are not listed on the monument. I don't know why they aren't listed, whether they were staff. I just don't know. Not far away, but on the other side of the Baltimore-Washington Parkway, on restricted government property, was the DC Children's Center, which was also known as the Cedar Knolls School Cemetery, and it was also for a DC facility. It was technically for delinquent youths. They had quite a few runaways. Although that was ordered to be shut down in 1986, 7 years later, it still had over 150 juvenile offenders. It actually closed in 1993. And the reason I bring that up is some of the death certificates that I have found there indicate that they died at Cedar Bluff or Cedar Knolls or the DC Children's Center, but they're listed as buried at Forest Haven. So there's a definite connection between the two. The Cedar Knolls Cemetery was also known by several other names. Originally, it was the Jacob Duvall Family Cemetery. Then it was the National Junior Republic Cemetery, which was a self-governing school for quote unquote unfortunate children. They didn't explain what unfortunate children covered. Then it was deeded over to the Evangelical Lutheran Church before being acquired by the District of Columbia Department of Human Services and renamed Cedar Knolls. An archaeological survey was done there in 2000, and 4 or 5 gravestones were found, 3 of which had inscriptions. And we know that there were at least 5 burials there, but they were all adults. They weren't children at all. And I have death certificates for Forest Haven that range everywhere from 3 hours old, which I think there must have been an indication that either the woman was pregnant when she came to Forest Haven or it was staff related. The oldest we found was 65 years old. And that's all I have for a presentation. If you want to open it to a chat. Anne?
Sorry,
I don't think I had any other
my
slides.
video going there. So yes, I'm just gonna to stop the share there, but the video is still recording. So if we need to bring up any of the pictures or any of the other maps or slides, we can certainly do that. So Tina, thank you so much for kind of sharing the background of how it came to be and the work that you're doing, because I think just from some of these personal connections, the stories that you've shared, it's it's all around, and there are people that are still here and then states away trying to make those connections, and it's hard when you can't physically go there, because a lot of times we're connected with our loved ones and we visit the cemetery and it's kind of peaceful and beautiful and we can't do that. So have you maybe heard from other family members or anything like that in terms of like how best they can connect with their ancestors or their loved ones?
Not really, no.
Okay.
It's pretty much been a one-way street.
I was just wondering. So we do have some questions and some comments. Like we said, Forest Haven was kind of familiar, especially for people growing up here in the 60s, 70s, 80s, when some of these tragedies were more commonplace in the news. So Abby or Genevieve, I'm gonna ask you to start the ball rolling with some of the comments or questions for me or Tina.
So I guess we'll start with the questions. So I see one currently. Daniel wanted to know, has anyone ever been held criminally responsible for any incidents there? And Daniel, feel free to correct me, but the way I'm interpreting this would be, have any of the staff or the administrators that were running Forest Haven in the 70s or 80s, were they held criminally responsible?
And you've done more research on articles than I have.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. So like I said, I didn't, take a huge dive into it, but from what I know from the records and some of the files we have at the museum, that there were lawsuits, through the course of several decades. So there were charges brought to against the staff person that was essentially embezzling and stealing funds from the organization, and I believe from patients as well. So he was charged in that. The kind of the malpractice physician, he was eventually, removed from Forest Haven. And the most, I guess the most visible product of that was in the lawsuits of the mid to late 70s. That did result in about like $2 million in today's money for the families that, that joined in like the class action lawsuit. So there was some restitution paid for some of the families of the victims in that kind of that late time period. But I don't know any specific cases about, jail time or any other thing like that. But there unfortunately are, quite a few different individual lawsuits or class action against the facility in general.
Thank you, Anne. And Daniel did confirm that was specifically what he was asking. Mary has a question. Has there been, and I think Tina, this is probably directed towards you more so than Anne. Has there been any ground penetrating radar done to search for additional graves?
No, there have not. What an aerial view pretty much shows where the known burials are. It's not a question of having a flat surface with no indications, which is where you typically use ground penetrating radar. We knew where most of the graves were. It was just locating more information after that.
Thank you, Tina. We did have some comments throughout the presentation with people sharing some of their personal connections to Forest Haven. And I'd encourage anyone who didn't look at the chat during the webinar to kind of go back and read particularly the story that Jenny shared. She worked at Lars back in the early 90s, and she shared some about her experience working with that. And I also would encourage people that Sue made a couple of comments. She was a former volunteer at Forest Haven, and she had some interesting insights to kind of the facility in the 80s as well that she made in a few comments. So thank you, Jenny and Sue, for sharing some of your background. Does anyone else have any questions that they'd like to post in the chat that we can help answer?
There was a question from Ty O in the Q&A that asked, what is the current standing of the property and what is the plan moving forward?
Anne?
I don't know. I was gonna pass that one over to you. I have not heard anything.
I think it's owned by New Beginnings. It's still a DC government
right.
Property.
And I saw we did have, a comment that someone I think works at New Beginnings. So there again, like we said, there's still people actively working on the property. But it's at the Job Corps Center or the New Beginnings facility, which again it's still owned by the district. So in terms of the abandoned buildings or anything like that, I have never heard of anything where it would be raised or rehabilitated or anything like that. I feel like the focus is just on those new facilities.
To reiterate, there are a number of haunted websites and things like that that mention Forest Haven and people that sneak onto the property. I had permission. I had a form that I had to fill out every time for the DC government, indicating who was going to be going out there, what date, what time, how many people, what we plan to do out there. So it was something that went to the government, got signed, And then I got contacted to say, yes, you can go. So now my understanding is there's a guard shack there, and people have to go through that to get to the property itself.
Yeah, and thank you for that reiteration as well, just in case you didn't hear kind of in the beginning that as you saw with some of those pictures from online, excuse me, it really is abandoned. It's full of asbestos, it's falling down, the bricks, the vines. It's not a place that anybody would want to go or should go, and they're not allowed to go. So there's some comments coming in from Catherine, so thank you. Again, reiterating that again, it is still, DC property, even though it's here in Anne Arundel County. But New Beginnings tore down 2 schools and 1 gym to create the new buildings facility, and Oak Hill is still there as well. We had a couple people raise their hands in the chat. Did you want to open up to speak, or did you want to just put anything into the chat? That goes for anyone else still listening as well.
I've been asked a couple times how I managed to get death certificates for these DC residents. In Maryland, if you die in a county in Baltimore City, it's where you died that matters. It's not where you actually lived or, where you had a residence. So the people who died at Forest Haven, whose death certificates I've been able to find, are listed in the Maryland death certificates.
We did have a good question from Susan, because I do understand that this might be a little confusing, especially with the chat right now. What is the relationship what is the relationship with Oak Hill? So between Oak Hill and Forest Haven.
I think it's just that it's the newest owner of that property.
And Kathleen just shared her connection as well, that she had volunteered at the Children's Center in the late 1960s. So thank you for sharing that, Kathleen. We'd love to talk to you more about that at some point.
Okay, well, yeah, again, thank you everyone for, for sharing your comments. And so this was really what we were hoping to get out of it was, the fact that you might hear it, it's been in the news, it's been some documentaries, you'll again, like Tina alluded to, you'll see it on ghost hunting sites and things like that. So it's kind of around, but we thought it was important to kind of, physically ground it, where it is in Laurel, and the weird kind of relationship with DC and, its physical location. But more importantly, especially as your comments are revealing tonight, just the human connections and the work that Tina and Dennis are doing to bring these people back to life and to have their stories documented and memorialized, as part of the the work that we're trying to do as well. So thank you for everyone who has shared their stories and memories in the chat. We would love to hear more about it. Put your information into our file so that more people can hear of these experiences, and again, just to make more people aware of what happened there, and even if it's such tragic history, that we're understanding and we're explaining and we're educating as to what happened, so we can we can have a better picture of what life in Laurel was like, especially for some of the people that live there.
We did get one more question from Laura Perez, who asked, were people mostly committed there by their families and sent there when their caregiver passed away? Or were there cases where people were taken from their families against their families' wishes?
I think most were taken against their family wishes. There may have been some circumstance in the family, like deaths of parents or some sort of abuse or something like that. But I think for the most part, the families really didn't want to give up their children. They were forced by other government agencies.
Yeah, thank you for that. And again, just like we said with the different terminology, there was a whole different culture, a whole different understanding of mental and physical disabilities and ailments, and just the whole concept of mental health was, very different from what we understand it now. Even just, a few years ago, going through the pandemic, we're at a different level of understanding and compassion for each other. And if you just, go back 100 years ago, certainly there was a completely different understanding of the needs of people with mental and physical ailments. So
There were a lot of people who were hospitalized there with tuberculosis. There were epileptics there. There were definitely people with mental deficiencies of different kinds. What they called idiocy. I'm looking at a list of some of these: muscular dystrophy, mental deficiency, imbecile level. A lot of cases of pneumonia. It's difficult to tell what they went there with as a diagnosis first, what they died of. In some cases, they were stripped of clothing, they were put in cold water baths, they were given all sorts of different treatments. So, a cause of death, aspiration. They were regurgitating their own body fluids, that kind of thing. So spastic injury, cause of death, burns, accidental. What's to say was caused by where they were versus what caused them to be there.
Yeah, thank you for that, Tina. I think that's an important distinction as well. We don't really kind of know what they came in there for, and then how they were treated, and kind of what was exacerbated or what came out later as well. We can only kind of capture little snapshots from like the death certificate or from other related records as well.
Yeah.
So I just want to thank everyone again. I am going to stop the recording, but we're going to maintain the webinar for a couple minutes. We have some upcoming programs we want to talk to you about. And again, we'll keep the chat open just so anyone can, put any last minute questions or comments in. So again, thank you so much for joining us. Tina, thank you especially for sharing your research with us. Abby and Genevieve, thank you for being with us tonight. And thank everyone for watching and being here in person and watching virtually. We hope we see you at the museum and connect with us online. Thank you very much.